my Beverly Hills 90210 fantasy was to get to Los Angeles and be here. What I've discovered is that Los Angeles is nothing like that, and it's even better. So I've been really happy finding my way around the city and just being part of the culture here.
You are working as a director of the humanities
and social sciences.
And social sciences, and that also includes
the UCLA Extension Writers Program.
That's
yes.
right, yeah. I know a lot of the instructors there. A lot of my friends also took extension courses. In fact, my first creative writing course was through UCLA Extension. So yeah, I mean, great job.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a huge community, but it's also, I think, a really wonderful and tight-knit community. It's been really fun to be a part of and get to know all the, I mean, it's so rooted in Los Angeles. It really feels like it's reflective of the literary community here, and that's one of the things I really value about it.
Your first book, First Risk, do you want to talk to us just a little bit about how the title came about?
As I was preparing it for publication, I came across a line near the end of the book that says, "What is love if not our first and most important risk?" And there was something about that that felt like it was really like announcing the thematic message of the book. So I zeroed in on that. And I was also thinking about Louise Glick's first collection called Firstborn. So I like that little wink about this being my first book and my first risk.
The book is amazing, and there are a lot of things that you weave together to actually make it into this whole book, like an experience, right? Mm-hmm. And some of the stuff that you talk about, there's of course the violence against Matthew Shepard, the myth of Venus and Adonis, but the one that really drew me in, right? And just not that the other parts of the book isn't great. It's like this is just like I have what amazing. I saw this and I was just like, let me skip to that section first and I'll finish the other sections later. It's because I love the movie All About My Mother. And in fact, you create characters, or actually you make monologues from the characters that exist in the movie. Talk to me about how, why you chose that movie and why you decided to explore that movie.
That is a great question. So Almodovar is one of my favorite filmmakers. I had studied film in my undergrad, so film form and film theory are really important to my writing practice, but I consider Almodovar to be one of my literary parents, even though he's not a writer. And that's because I'm really drawn to the way that he combines high camp, but also serious drama and deep emotion. For me, he's like a person who's saying two things can be true. This can be really moving, and it can also be riotously funny. And I think he also asks us to ask questions about why we're laughing and when we're laughing. So those are things that are deeply ingrained in me. This was a movie, I returned to it often. So I had returned to it during the writing of this book, and I was so invested in the characters. They're all going through so much, and but they're also trying to understand how to love and how to grieve, and that was a really core theme of the book.
I would like to ask you to read one of the poems, one of my favorite poems from the book. La Grado explains plastic surgery.
Okay. The body awakens like a sleeper cell to the secret phrase or melody that turns it against itself. Loose skin shifts like flags turning in fickle wind. Once my body was a boy, uncomplicated, smooth eyebrow lines, full head of hair, then chaos. The hair burned off like fog. Everything lengthened, the hair diffused all across my body like emigre. And later, my disappointment. I wanted to be more whole, to buy breasts. I filed my chin down to a delicate nub. I tell you, chica, if you want something done, do it with a knife.
Thank you for that. I love that so much, and that killer last line. And I love the fact that you also create monologues from the other characters. I mean, I would love to read all of them, but we just don't have time, so we're going to move on. But because I really want to get to Nanopedia, I know my first encounter with you as a poet was, in fact, Nanopedia. I hope that it lets you to know that like it's actually being recommended, you know, in the poetry circles that at least I'm around, you know.
I mean, it surprises me, but I'm really happy.
No, because there is something about Nanopedia. It's like there is like a scope that's like really ambitious, but also it always holds true to like the poet himself. And I feel like that balance is very, very difficult because like a lot of the times even going through, if you look at some of the sections, I don't know if you wanted to tell us some of the names of the sections.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let me talk a little bit about the conceit of the book and then dive into that. So I had written a bunch of prose poems as a writing prompt to myself when I was going through a time I just didn't feel inspired. But I wanted to try to write every day. And so I would write a definition of a word that I encountered during the day that somehow stuck with me for whatever reason. But my rule was I couldn't literally define the word. I had to show or give like an oblique definition somehow. And I did that for a few months. And I think I had more than 100 at the end. And I just never knew. I didn't do them to write a book. I was doing them to just keep my craft sharp. And so I sat with those poems for about 10 years before I figured out how they all hung together. I also made a formal decision about them as I was trying to work them into the book, which was they had to fit in a 3-inch by 3-inch square on a piece of paper. So I revised them down to they could be shorter, but they couldn't be longer than that space. So that made me make really difficult choices about which poems I could include and what those poems would actually say. But it was a really great exercise for craft. And I remember I was at the Kachemak Bay Writers Conference in Alaska, and I had been wrestling with these poems, and nothing made sense about how they could be a book together. And I don't know, it was really like a lightning strike, like an encyclopedia. But because the poems were designed to be so short, this was going to be the world's tiniest encyclopedia of American culture, and that's how I got Nanopedia. The iPod Nano was very popular then, so that was, I think, part of the inspiration. But when I approached this, these poems are a lot about what it means to be American, but also, I feel like it's almost like the idea of American culture, like, taken to a fetishized level of, like the first section is called Americana, which is, I think of it as an obsession with Americanness, like for the sake of being obsessed with America. Like, there's no purpose behind it. It's just like maybe patriotism taken way too far. Then I have the American land and her creatures, because I did have a lot of living things in here. The complete abridged history of America, which I think is 7 poems long. And then there's one called Exile in America, a nanobiography, and America from Space. So I was really like thinking about all the different ways that you can look at America through a personal lens, through a public lens, through biology, really just, yeah.
It's a paradox, and that's what makes it so great, is that it's the world's smallest encyclopedia, but if you just look at the sections names, it sounds like it's going to cover so much ground. Yes. I mean, like more than a normal encyclopedia, in fact, would be able to cover. So it has that
I
scope.
love that tension of, someone telling you that they're doing everything and they're doing the least possible. It's kind of how I think of it.
Okay, that was like a writing exercise. Do you find it easier if you actually give yourself, like, I think as Robert Frost called it, like tennis nets, right? Like, when you're playing tennis, like, you need to have a net, and like, he like really didn't like free verse because he's like, that's like playing tennis with
the net down.
Yeah.
Rude.
Rude. But like, do you feel that like it actually kind of giving it weirdly like boundary gives it freedom, or?
Well, this takes me back to one of my first workshops in grad school, and one of my classmates, the poet Erin Radcliffe, was commenting on my draft, and she said, I think Charlie's work is always deeply informed by form. And I had never considered that, but like I never stopped thinking about it afterward. I think she was so right, and it was really important insight for me to have at the moment I needed it most. And I think if you look at my books, the structure of the poems is important. The structure of the book is important. How the poems elapse over time when you read them. I love traditional form. I also love corrupting those forms. So in my first book, there's a poem, one of the Venus and Adonis poems is actually a broken ghazal, which you can't tell by looking at it, but when you read it aloud, you hear the refrain come through again and again. I've also written upside down ghazals, where the character of the voice announces themselves at the beginning and then talks through, and that's a really interesting technique because then the last couplet of the poem has the double refrain at the end, right? So you get this like really haunting echo. So yeah, I love to experiment with form. I love to steal forms. I didn't mention it, but Nanopedia is all prose poems, so that was a very specific exercise that I was undertaking. I do love the prose poem. I love combining prose and poetry. There are no rules for me.
Can we please hear a poem from Nanopedia?
Sure. Let me say one more thing about
Yes.
the titles in the book, because they changed a lot over time. I limited myself to titles that were terms that were either coined or corrupted by American culture. And I say that because the one I'm going to read does that. Alternate fact is one of the titles here. So, you know, when that was floated as an idea, I was like, what? That's amazing. That's going in the book. Like, I'm going to critique that. Like, we cannot have that idea. I feel like sometimes the relationship between the poem and the title is something the reader has to intuit after reading. But that was a core part of this book, was connecting this to the zeitgeist of the culture at the time. Economic bailout. When Americans invented money, they had no word for it. So for a while, they just called it you, like a stranger who comes to town with a bag full of tricks and elixirs. When they rubbed crisp bills against their bodies, they'd say, "You feel like fine-grained sand," and "You feel like cold rain," when it was coins. Or when they were poor, they'd tell their friends, "I don't have as much of you as I'd like." It was a touching statement, and together Americans resolved to end poverty and in the process accidentally created marriage. For a while, no one was poor or lonely because love and money were sharing the same bed and everyone had what they needed. But when they wanted more you, they couldn't understand if they needed more love or more money. Over time, all anyone argued about was money or each other. "I've had enough of you," they'd say. And then some smart person invented divorce.
When you started putting this book together, were there any inspirations in your mind? Or like, did you think that, okay, like I can maybe borrow something from this book in structuring it?
Yes. So there was a poet I knew when I was developing those prose poems named Jeremy Hallinan, and his first book, I think, had 7 sections in it. I'd never seen that before, and I was really fascinated by it. I thought it was such a cool idea. So I've been carrying that around for a long time and trying to figure out how I might employ many sections in a book. And this was the perfect book to do that because it tries to do so much already. It really was informed by the currency of the moments I was living in over these years. Poems come into a manuscript, poems get kicked out of a manuscript. It's part of the natural process. I think as you work on a book, the book starts to tell you what it wants to be and how it should be collected. And that definitely happened with Nanopedia. It does owe a debt to Ambrose Bierce's The Devil's Dictionary, which goes back quite a ways in history, but that was a satirical approach to defining things. I do think that the process of trying to define and limit is something that we should be very skeptical about at all times. So there should always be an element of parody or satire when we undertake that as poets. The prose poem as a form, I think, it really demands the poet to do a little bit more, because if you take away lineation, you're taking away one of the main idioms of poetry. So you have to bring in, more structure, more consideration. You really have to be thinking about sound, rhyme and slant rhyme. You have to think about rhythm. The poet Elizabeth Hiscox said to me once, that she thought the prose poem was an urgent form. And that has also stuck with me because I think it's very true. The prose poem wants to race to its finish. And that's where you get that sense of urgency. With no line breaks, you have no intuitive pauses in the work. So mastering that natural flow is really important when writing the prose poem.
Oh, that's really amazing, and that's very great advice too.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I think I sometimes my poems actually come out in blocks, and then sometimes later on I work at it to see like if the poem is calling for a form.
I do think about,
Yeah.
when I talk about form, I mean the organization within the poem, but I also mean everything about how the poem presents itself to the reader, which includes how it's using white space on the page.
To actually see that intention is like another part of the delight when I'm like, reading your work, because that is exactly right. It's like there's a, I would say like an intellectual level of layers, and then there's like the formal architectural layers.
Yeah, and I think it's an opportunity to reestablish theme or to confirm theme. So thinking about a long poem like Safe from The First Risk, which is about the murder of Matthew Shepard, and on the page it looks like the long beams of a split rail fence, and there's a lot of white space in between each couplet, which creates a lot of silence in the poem, but it sort of like structurally, visually reinforces this other part of the story that I'm trying to tell.
This is the most recent poetry publication, Instructions Between Takeoff and Landing. You lost your mother before the collection, and in fact, a lot of the work in the book is struggling also with the loss and coming to terms with it. And in layers of that, in conjunction to that, there's a question about faith. I think that really a lot of the poems are gesturing towards, but what I found interesting was also you invented this other form where there is an instruction and then there are questions after.
Yes.
And I thought, oh, when I like stepped back and thought about it, I was like, oh, what like a great way in some ways to think about faith. Because faith is really a lot of questioning, right? Like you whether through questioning, and that's how you know that your faith is strong or things like that. So could you talk to us about how like the book came about and like how you invented that form?
Sure. That is a big question, so I'll do my best. The poems that you referenced, I call them reading comprehension exam questions or poems. And they were really the first part of the book that made itself known to me as I was writing. And it was a deeply intuitive process. I wish I could say like, here's how I came up with the idea, but I wrote a prose poem and then I hit enter a couple times and I wrote quiz on this section. And then I wrote 4 questions. And I was like, what am I doing? This is weird. Can I do this? Should I do this? And I think those are questions I ask a lot about the formal elements of my work. Also something I've never done before, I wrote all of these poems in one document. So I would write and then I would come back to the file the following day and I would add something new to it. But I don't think I ever wrote questions without having first written a paragraph. So that was, in terms of process, it was always tied together. And I did that maybe 40 or 50 times. Of course, not all of them are good. So that's problem number one. But I did let those sit for a while because I wanted to kind of understand how I could leverage that form to do something different. And what I discovered over time, there is a speaker in the paragraph. Often it is like me or just like, close to me. And it does have elements of memoir to it. Like you mentioned, the passing of my mother, that is something that those poems are concerned with. There are other times where I am appropriating a more scholarly, authoritative voice for whatever purpose. But when I got into the questions, there were 2 really important discoveries I made. One was that the questions were anticipating the responses of the critic and presenting them before the critic could. And in some ways, that's also the reflection of the critic that lives in my own brain about my own work, which can be stifling and can actually prevent you from getting words on the page. But in this case, I was really trying to invite that voice in and to let that voice also be critiqued for its function. So you'll see in the early versions of these poems, the voice is often critiquing the speaker of the poem. But by the end of the collection, the critic is critiquing the reader. like no one is safe in this book. The other thing I really like about the form is that none of these poems are complete until the reader is present and engaging with the work. So I think the thoughtful responses the reader has to the questions, both about what they read or about the bigger questions that the questions are trying to get to, I think that is part of this work. And I just loved discovering a way that I can make the reader an essential part of the poem. So it's really, each poem's like a triangulation of the poet, the critic, and the reader, all kind of working in tandem to make meaning of this, topic or idea.
Without further ado, let's please read a poem from the book. The one that I would like you to read is Dissection.
Okay. Yeah. For a time, I believed people could hear my thoughts. How else did they know my most private desires, the reluctance in my heart when I looked too long at a boy in my class? There was no privacy then. I remember the anatomical model in biology class, the clear skin whose organs, color-coded, could be removed for study. The way the children tore each one out and tossed them back and forth, laughing, disgusted. I wanted their freedom, the way they never needed to learn anything about themselves. Quiz on this section. A, briefly explore the difference between the terms public and private. B, write down the names of 3 people you victimized as a child. C, why has God forsaken his children? Atheists only, why have you forsaken God? D, if freedom isn't free, calculate its unit cost based on the information in the passage. And there are a couple questions in there that I think are purposefully unable to be answered, with or without the paragraph. Some of them are nonsense, and I think to me, that's satirizing the reading comprehension exam as a form, and getting to something that like the question suggests that you should know this, right? Like it is answerable, but these not all of them are. And then some of the questions to me are really funny. Like there's one that's, is it more or less difficult to be a homosexual? Be honest. Like it's that extra admonition of like, we know you're gonna lie. Or who is the villain of this story and every story, which is like, me,
And we are now going to go to your latest, in fact, publication. This is creative nonfiction, but it's really a memoir. Mm-hmm. I do want you to read from the book a section. And this one is like, again, a personal favorite of mine because I feel like in the popular culture, but especially in the gay culture, we have this like affinity to this movie that you reference in the book, which is Fatal Attraction. And the way that we connect with the movie also is through, in fact, who's intended to be the villain of the story.
In the film essay here, I write about how Dan is the villain of Fatal Attraction, and that Alex is actually, for most of the movie, like a really rational, like her anger is really justified because Dan is trying to have it all, trying to have his cake and eat it too. So in my personal story, I wrote about how I had decided that I was going to seduce one of my professors who I thought was cute, and then engaged in a process I called Operation Hot for Teacher, which was mainly what I was wearing to class to get his attention. And then about halfway through that experience, I realized it was working, and I got scared. I did not think that was a plausible outcome. And so I'll read just how this all got wrapped up. In the middle of Operation Hot for Teacher, when I was deep in the academic mire of my project, I asked Ted, my professor, if he would be willing to do an independent study with me in the winter quarter, helping me refine ideas in preparation for the senior project seminar in my final term. He agreed, and prior to falling for my boyfriend Tori, I was thrilled about the opportunity to learn from him and maybe kiss his face. But after Torrey, I worried about how my fall quarter choices might come looking for their logical end. That Ted might expect things from me now, things I didn't want to do, things I'd rather pretend were an accident or inconsequential. I decided to call him and back out of the arrangement. I picked a time I thought he wouldn't be there, preferring to leave a message. "This is Ted," he said, answering the phone. My stomach twisted into knots. "It's Charlie," I said, "from meaning class." "Yes, Charlie." His tone warmed like sugar into caramel. "How are you?" "Listen, about the independent study thing." A silence opened between us. I tried to dive through the phone to picture what was happening on his end, sitting in his chair. Was he looking out the window? Was he smiling? Was he fidgeting with something on his desk? Was he thinking about me? "Turns out I can't do it this quarter. My schedule." Like it was an explanation. "Oh, I understand." "I'm sorry." "Not at all." He took a breath. "Does this mean I won't be seeing you again?" I didn't know what to say. The answer was clearly no. Could I just say no? "I don't know," I said. He was quiet again for a second. "Is this the moment where you sever all your connections to me and vanish from my life?" His voice had become very small, thin, uncharacteristic of the charismatic man who dazzled at the front of his classroom. This was the Ted beneath the Ted, the vulnerable, emotional part of him. I knew this was the moment our connection would be severed. He knew that this was his moment. But I had never told someone that moment had arrived. I didn't know how. I was stupid enough to believe that showing up to class and flouncing around in my cutest outfits to get the attention of an older man wouldn't have consequences for me, not if I didn't want them. But not for 1 second had I considered what kind of consequences I was tossing in someone else's face when I did that. Of course, sexual accountability is complex and nuanced. I never consented to any activity. I removed myself from the one event, his house party, where that could have been a construed outcome. But I knew what my intention was. It was safe to say he did too. And now his intentions with me were also clear. But it sounded like he never saw it as a sexual affair. It sounded like he truly liked me, something I wasn't even sure I could say about myself. No, of course not. I wanted to offer him something, a consolation prize. But I only sought exoneration from the guilt of knowing I'd hurt someone, reckless and foolish. I consoled no one. Ted knew I was lying. "Well, then I look forward to our paths crossing again." His office chair shrieked the way a mouse might as he rolled across it. I told him I was sure we'd see each other on campus. I pictured that recklessly long scarf flapping in the wind, the way I'd watched him on campus weeks before, during a particularly blustery day. He hadn't known I was watching. He carried an armful of papers down the main quad, that scarf reaching into the sky like a hand grasping at something just out of reach. His hair riffled on his head, and the bottom of his coat blew open behind him. The way the sun lit him, the expression on his face, some kind of bliss, like he was in the right place doing the right thing. At that time, I thought it was beautiful, and now I envied the confidence. I had none. In 6 months, nothing about my life would bear resemblance to where I was during that last phone call, the last time I spoke to Ted, the last time I was naive enough to believe getting what I wanted and getting what I needed were the same thing. I was the villain of this story.
I hope that you're working on another book of poetry soon, because I cannot get enough of it. I'm sure there's not going to be another memoir. I'm sure that,
Maybe there is.
Maybe there is. So is there in the future, near future, would we be, what are the projects that you're working on?
I am working on another memoir that's focused on singing karaoke for the last 20 years. It's called Hot Mic, What I Sang at Karaoke and the Men Who Drove Me to Do It. And I also have another poetry collection that I feel really good about, but it is called Career Suicide, so hopefully it's not prophetic, but funny.
That's amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jeremy.